Hello, students. Good morning. So, welcome to this topic review. This is going to be for relative classes. This is in case you didn't get a chance to join in this session or you were distracted for some reason. Make sure you pay attention to this video explanation because it is going to be very, very important for your project and for your final exam. All right. So, here we go. We're going to talk about relative clauses. And when we talk about relative clauses, in this case, we're going to talk about two different types, defining and non-defining. All right. So let us begin. For us to be able to start, first we need to cover a few things. All right. So we're going to start from the very, very beginning. The first thing we need to cover is what do we use relative clauses for? And that's simple. We use them to give extra information about a person or a thing. All right, so just to give information about a person or a thing. That's basically it. The next thing we need to ask ourselves is, do we need something in particular? Well, in this case, we do. We do need something in particular. And this is where this topic comes into play, which is relative pronouns. I'm pretty sure you guys already saw relative pronouns at any moment throughout your educational career. You might have seen this. So here's a table with the relative pronouns, what they refer to, and an example. All right, so if you have any problems with these, make sure you study this table or you attend my tutoring session at 2 p.m. All right, so either way is fine, but you cannot do relative clauses if you do not know how to apply relative pronouns properly. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now that we got that out of the way, we can start with our topic. Like we mentioned, there are two types of relative clauses. So we're going to start with the first one. This is the one that most teachers start with. This is the most basic one. And we're talking about defining relative clauses. So these are the ones that give us essential information to identify the person or thing we are talking about. Okay, so from this, what we really need to take this to your grave, not literally, but keep this in mind at all times. Defining relative clauses, essential information, they define or identify the person who we're talking about. All right, this is what you need to remember from defining relative clauses. So let's see one example because you might not be following me so far. So here it is. Here's our example right there in this red rectangle. And it says dog that likes, sorry, dogs that like cats are very unusual. So are we talking about all dogs in general? No, we're not. We're only talking about the ones that like cats. So what is a relative clause here? A relative clause is this one, that like cats. Okay, there we go. That's it. Which is our relative pronoun, because it's always good to identify those two. Our relative pronoun is that. Okay, so this relative clause is defining who we're talking about. All right, sorry, there we go. It's defining who we're talking about. And it's telling us that we're not talking about all dogs. We're only talking about the ones that like cats. All right, so that's what this little, this bullet right here talks about. So like we mentioned, the relative clause gives us that information. If we remove the relative clause, let me scribble over it so you can get an idea. So imagine we remove this completely, right? So now it says dogs are very unusual. Are we still talking about the same group of dogs? No, now we're talking about all dogs in the world, all dogs in general. So the meaning changed significantly. We're not even talking about the same group of dogs anymore. So we cannot remove this and still have the same meaning in our sentence, all right? So that is something we always have to take into consideration. They give us essential information. By essential, we mean it cannot be removed because if you remove it, the meaning changes completely. All right, let's analyze some more examples to help us out. So Very important to listen to what it says right here. Pay attention to what's in bold. So in bold, we have this right here, right? This is our relative clause, like we mentioned in the first one, right? What is a relative pronoun? Who, right there, relative pronoun. All right. So for this first sentence, children who hate chocolate are uncommon. Are we talking about all children in general? No, we're only talking about the ones who hate chocolate. All right, so we have to keep that in mind. Again, if we remove this, if we remove who hate chocolate and just say children are uncommon, is it still the same meaning? No, it's not. Now we're talking about all children. And that's actually a pretty fat lie because children are very common in most places. So there we go. We need that to be able to make sense of the sentence how we want it to. All right. So let's analyze this one. Go to the very bottom. All right. This one, imagine if we removed the bold lettering and now it just says the teacher makes me cry. Can you tell me which teacher makes me cry? If I just tell you the teacher makes me cry? No, you can't, because you guys have a lot of teachers, right? So you cannot point out which one makes me cry. But if I add this essential information, this defining relative clause, and now I say the teacher who smells like onions makes me cry, which teacher makes me cry? The one that smells like onions, right? So now you guys know. So that is why this is defining, because it defines who you're talking about. So this is defining who we're talking about, right? All right, let's move on to the next one. This next one is the other type of relative clause, which is non-defining relative clauses. Okay, so for this, we have to go back to defining relative clauses. So for defining, we must remember essential information, they define or identify what we're talking about. All right, so this is going to be the complete opposite. This one, oh, let's read this first. All right, non-defining relative clauses. They tell us more about someone or something, but the information in these clauses does not help us to define what we're talking about. So what's important from this one? Does not define. All right, so that is what we must remember from this one. Non-defining does not define. They don't tell us what we're talking about. Here we can see it in an example, right? So this example right here, if we say gorillas, which are large and originate in Africa, can sometimes be found in zoos, we're talking about all gorillas, all right? All gorillas, not just some of them. So the information that we're adding right there is general about gorillas. It's not defining any particular group of gorillas because it applies to all of them. If we remove the non-defining relative clause, we're still talking about all gorillas. If I just say gorillas can sometimes be found in zoos, I'm still talking about all gorillas, right? So the meaning didn't change at all. So that's what we have to take into consideration and never forget. There's a very, very important note over here on the bottom, and it says, we always add commas, all right? Always, if we're talking about non-defining relative clauses. So that's another thing that you have to keep in mind. If you do not add the commas, you are basically making a defining relative clause, which in that case would be incorrect because you want to make a defining relative clause, right? So grammatically it would be incorrect. Keep that in mind. So continuing here, listen to our man Saitama over here in the corner. He's saying that they all have commas. So we have to remember that. Let's analyze this first example. It says, Juan's mother, who lives in Veracruz, has 15 grandchildren. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about Juan's mom, right? What happens if I remove this, who lives in Veracruz? What happens if I just say, Juan's mother has 15 grandchildren? Are we talking about somebody different? No, we're still talking about Juan's mother, right? Juan's mom. So even if we remove the non-defining relative clause, we're still talking about the same person. We still understand who we're talking about. because this is not defining who we're talking about, right? That's why it's called non-defining. So in this case, it's also very important just to understand what what the topic means. Defining, they define. Non-defining, they don't define. All right. So very important for you guys to follow that. Let's see one of the other examples over here. If I say this last one, all right, we're only covering a couple. So this one says, our English teacher who sucks at teaching made a presentation. How many English teachers do you have this semester? Well, you only have one, right? So who are we talking about? We're talking about me. So we already know who we're talking about. Even if we remove this, we don't have to add this. This is extra information. If I just say our English teacher made a presentation, who are we talking about? We're still talking about me, right? So we don't need this to define. What happens though if I remove English? What happens if I just tell you guys, our teacher made a presentation? Do you know who I'm talking about? No, right? Again, you guys have way too many teachers, so it's impossible for us to know. So I just changed this into a sentence that needs to be defined. So we need a defining relative clause now. So I can say our teacher who has very pretty eyes made a presentation. So now, which teacher am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the one that has very pretty eyes, right? So, so good so far? Yes. Let's continue. This is the last part of the presentation. It is just basically analyzing the differences. So I'll give you a second to pause this and try to guess what are the differences, if you can remember them, between defining and non-defining. So here we go. Defining, one of the most important differences is that for defining, we do not use commas. And for non-defining, we do use commas, all right? Always commas. Defining, no commas. Non-defining, between commas. So like we mentioned, defining gives you essential information, necessary. We needed to know who we're talking about. And non-defining gives you extra information. It's not necessary. It does not define who we're talking about. Okay, let's analyze this example because a lot of times you might find yourself uh, making a different kind of sentence than one of your classmates, even if you're talking about the same thing. If you guys are talking about one brother, right? My brother, in this case. But depending on the situation, it's going to change. All right. So this applies to different people in their particular situation. All right. So let's focus on this first one, the one for defining. This person has more than one brother. Okay. So let's imagine this person has three brothers. And let's imagine that she says, I called my brother. Do we know which brother she called? No, we do not. It is impossible to know unless she gives us more information. So now that she gave us more information, and now that she's saying, I call my brother who lives in Miami, there we go, who lives in Miami. Now we know which brother she's talking about, right? The one who lives in Playas. All right, this is assuming that the other two brothers do not live in Playas. Keep that in mind. All right, and let's go back to our other friend that only has one brother. If she says my brother is older, do we know who she's talking about? Well, yes, we do, because she only has one brother. She doesn't have to clarify which brother she's talking about because she only has one. So for her, this wouldn't have to be a non-defining relative clause because once she says my brother, we already know who she's talking about. So this is how, depending on the person's perspective, the person's context, it is gonna change. All right, even if they're using the same subject, my brother. All right, even if they're talking about the same person, it is gonna change if their situation is different. All right, and the last one is, well, this is something that you guys saw before, and it is that we can use the relative pronoun that to replace who or which, right? But this can only be done in defining relative clauses. This cannot be done in non-defining. Okay, so make sure you remember that if you want to use a non-defining relative clause, you cannot use that. It is okay to do it in defining, but not in non-defining. All right, and that brings us to the end. So at this point, if you haven't already, remember you have to make a mind map. What the most important information here, make sure everybody is able to understand the mind map. All right. By using these two different types of relative clauses, we will make our writing a lot stronger. So make sure that you are able to master both of them. And like I mentioned, if you struggle with either one of them or both of them, make sure that you visit me at my tutoring session at 2 p.m. All right. I'll leave you with the references there. Remember that you have access to this PowerPoint presentation in our Blackboard group. So if you want to download it from there, feel free. Go over it, visit the sources, or just grab your information from the presentation. All right. So that was it from me. I'll see you next time. If you have any other questions, you can also ask me in our class. All right. Hope you guys have a great day. I'll see you next time and take care. Peace.